The topic for this video is an idea called survivorship. If we take a look at this graph here, this represents what we're looking at. And this may be a little different than some of the graphs that you've seen in the past because there's three different types of information that are plotted on here. One of the first things you always have to do when you're looking at a graph is figure out what the different sides, or what we call the different axes of the graph, are showing you. The x-axis is the one that runs across. The y-axis is the one that runs vertically. So we'll start by looking at the x-axis. This one is showing us age. So we have young individuals all the way on the left, all the way to old individuals on the right. And then as we move up, this shows number of survivors. So here we'd have a very low number of survivors. Up at the top, we have a very high number of survivors. So we'll look at each of these different types. Each type is represented by a species that shows that type of survivorship. So we'll talk about those examples, but I want you to understand that these are not the only examples. There's many things that would fall into the different types of survivorship. I'll give you some other examples as we move forward. We'll start off with type 1 because that's the type that applies to people. If we look at people, so our graph appears the purple line, we start off at the same point as everybody else. So you got a high number of individuals that are very young. That's where all three groups are starting, and then the groups will change as time increases, as age increases. So for people, you have many individuals that are very young. Think of young people and maybe people that are getting out like into their teens and early 20s. Survivorship there is very, very high. It's rare for someone to die in their childhood years or their teenage years or even into their 20s and early 30s. It's rare for someone to die during that time, so we have high survivorship. The number of survivors remains very, very high for people into those years. Once we hit middle age, the numbers start to decline a bit, and then the numbers drop off very steeply once you get to old age. So maybe around 60, 70, 80, 90 years old, that's when we start to see this drop off. So what it's showing you with type 1 is that most younger individuals, because remember the young ones are on this side of the graph, so when we have young individuals, survivorship is very high. Very few individuals die young for these species. Most individuals die of old age. So if you think about a different species rather other than people that would apply to this, most of our top level predators and things like that would fall into this category. So think of a lion, a lion living in the savannah. What's going to kill a lion? Well, really nothing. I mean, they're the top of the food chain. So lions have very high survivorship early on, and then they end up dropping off as they get older and they start dying of old age or something like that. Type 2 survivorship is interesting. This one is just a straight line going across the graph. What that tells us is for a type 2 individual, age doesn't matter. This individual is just as likely to die when they're young as when they're old. So age really has no impact on the survivorship of this species. So the example they give here are birds, and birds are honestly a very good example of this. An older bird doesn't necessarily have a better chance of survival or a worse chance of survival than a younger bird. So if you think of other animals that would fit into this group, something like a squirrel, would also fit into a type 2 survivorship curve. Age doesn't really help protect them at all. They're not necessarily more vulnerable when they're young, but they're not necessarily more vulnerable when they're old either. So they see a nice type 2 type of a linear line here. Then the last one is type 3. In this case, we're actually seeing very many individuals die off right away. So early on, very, very few individuals make it. Amphibians are a good example of this. So this one is supposed to be the golden toad, but if you think of something like frogs and tadpoles, right? Each frog will have hundreds of offspring, so they'll have hundreds of little tadpoles swimming around. And if you know anything about fishing, what happens to most of those tadpoles? Well, most of them get eaten by fish. So the survivorship for very, very young individuals is poor. So most young individuals in a type 3 survivorship curve are dying. They're getting eaten off by something. A common example of something like this beyond the toads or the frogs here are something like sea turtles. Sea turtles lay a bunch of eggs and just leave them on the beach, And part of the problem with sea turtles is there's basically no maternal care. The mother sea turtle doesn't take care of the babies at all. They have to find their own way to the ocean. So many of them don't even make it to the ocean. They get picked off by birds. And once they do get there, they're very, very small and they're very susceptible to predation. So it's easy for them to get eaten by other species. So what we're seeing there is many young individuals are dying, but once they reach old age, their survivorship's very good, actually. It's rare for them to die as an adult. So the sea turtles are a perfect example here. A lot of them are dying very quickly in the beginning, but once they reach adulthood and they start developing, nothing really eats an adult sea turtle. So they then have very good survivorship all the way out until they die of something in old age. So there are 3 different types here. It would be good for you to know a few different examples of each one, instead of just the one that's in the picture, maybe be able to list a couple of examples. That would certainly help some things when it comes to understanding survivorship. We'll take a second to give you some notes on each one, like on each different type, so you understand what each one represents. So we'll start off with type 1. Here we have the young typically survive well. And then most individuals die of old age. For type 2, here we have age has no impact on survivorship. So remember, this is the one that was just basically like the straight line going through the graph. Age doesn't help them survive. It also doesn't become a liability. For type 3, many of the young die. So again, think of something like the tadpoles that never get to develop into a frog because they get eaten by fish or other things. But the old, the older individuals are well protected. It's not liking my E's today. So if we're thinking again of like the sea turtles in this example, the young sea turtles are very susceptible to predation from birds or other animals once they get into the ocean. But once they develop into an adult, then they're very well protected. So you could think of that as maybe a different one than adult, maybe just, or rather different than old. Just think of it as the adults, being well protected. So we've got our 3 different types of survivorship. If you understand the general characteristics around each one and how that's represented on the graph, you should be all set for these. So thank you for watching, and be sure to check out the next video.